Hi AP World History students, Mrs. Longnecker here with another video in our developing series about the short answer question. If you haven't watched the previous video or you weren't in class for that lesson, make sure that you watch part 1 before you watch part 2 because I'm going to be referring back to some of that information and it might be a little bit confusing if you watch these out of order. This video is going to give you a few more tips for success on your SAQ and walk you through some guided practice as well as an opportunity to see some of my practice with annotations for a sample response to an SAQ. Before I go any further though, I need to give credit where credit is due. A lot of the content that I'm using for these videos comes from a workshop that I attended via the internet with Amanda from Fiveable. And so I just want to say a huge thank you to Amanda for her work in teaching teachers how to make the SAQ less scary. A lot of the tips and strategies that I have to make this easier for you have come directly from her work. So a huge thank you to her. And without further ado, let's get on with the show. In the first video, I introduced the acronym ACE to help you have some structure for crafting your SAQ responses. These are some tips to help you ace your SAQ. ACE, remember, answer the question, cite evidence, elaborate or expand your reasoning. So, tip number 1, it's okay to reword the prompt to be clear about what you're answering. It's not required, but it's okay. Sometimes it's actually a good idea because it helps to keep your thinking on track. Number 2, be sure that you do the task assigned by a particular SAQ. Some SAQs will be comparative or change over time. Others might ask you to identify or explain a broader trend or an idea in world history. But especially if it's one of those compare or change over time tasks, or even a contextualization task, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the school year, you need to do that task. A beautifully crafted response with a lot of historical evidence that fails to do the task assigned still earns 0 points. So just look out for those keywords like similarity, difference, change, continuity, or the phrase stays the same, differed. Those are all good words that will clue you into the task that you are supposed to be doing. Number 3, this is something I didn't talk about in the last video, but I will be talking about it again in future videos. If there's a stimulus, if there's a piece of text or an image that goes along with a particular SAQ, you must refer to it directly in your answer. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to quote the stimulus, but there has to be a direct statement in your response that links back to the stimulus. Number 4, when you're thinking about the evidence in the C in your ACE, your evidence needs to be as specific as possible. Vague references or general historical statements will not be accepted. I always encourage students to think about proper nouns, the names of people, places, events. If those don't apply, sometimes your specific evidence could be specific and relevant historical vocabulary or other details that don't quite fit into proper noun but are still clear and specific. Number 5, you need to assume that your reader has no background and make sure that all of your ideas are stated clearly. It's not because your readers on the AP exam or your teacher in class doesn't have background, because of course we do. What that means though is that your reader is only allowed to judge your response based on exactly the words that you write. So if you're not clear in your reasoning, we can't infer that you know what you're talking about. Even as your teachers who know you and know what you know because we've seen you practice this knowledge in class before, for example, we can't infer that you know it. We can only go based on what you've actually written. So be sure that your ideas are stated as though you were writing to someone who didn't know about the topic in advance. And lastly, number 6, a reminder, I'll say it again and again, complete sentences for your short answer questions. This is a writing task, not a how many facts do you remember task. So bullet points are not accepted on the short answer questions. Are you ready for some practice? I hope so, because that's what's coming up next. So here is the SAQ that we used in class along with this lesson. If you've already done this practice in class, You could go ahead and skip to a later section of the video if you want, or go ahead and practice this one again. If you weren't in class, you may need to pause the video to give yourself some extra time to read and plan out your response before you move on to the next section. So the stimulus is on the left. It's the quote from the Analects of Confucius. The prompt is on the right. Using the document and your knowledge of history, identify and explain one way in which a Confucian view of leadership represented a change from that of legalism. At this point, I'd like you to pause the video and analyze both the prompt and the stimulus and go ahead and craft your answer. And when you unpause the video, I'll walk you through what we're looking for in the prompt as well as what a strong answer might look like. Hopefully at this point you've had a chance to pause the video and write your own response. So before we go to looking at my response, I'm going to have you annotate your own response. So read back through what you wrote and look to see, did you reword the prompt probably in your first sentence when you initially answered the question? Did you say something about a way that Confucian leadership represents a change from that of legalism? If you did, great. Not a requirement, but definitely off to a good start. Once you've restated or reworded the prompt, have you actually answered the question? Have you given a specific way that Confucian views represent a change from that of legalism? If so, that's your A. Go ahead and mark that next to your own response. Annotate your own response by marking where your A is. In order to be successful in this task, you need to clearly state a difference between Confucian leadership and legalist leadership, and then cite a particular example. Your example might be primarily from your knowledge of history, but there should be some reference to the prompt, to the stimulus with the prompt itself. So look back at the stimulus and see where in your response have you connected to that stimulus. Underline your direct reference to the stimulus in your own response and look for your specific evidence, your specific historical evidence that supports the answer that you gave, and annotate that with a C. Now, read through your response one more time and look for any place where you've given any sort of elaboration or expansion to clarify your reasoning. Mark that, annotate that with an E. And if you have an A, a C, and an E, and if you've underlined a direct reference to the stimulus, you have aced this SAQ. Congratulations. Unpause, I guess. All right, next we're going to go ahead and take a look at one of my responses. So here is my response. If you need to pause the video to read it, you can go ahead and do that. But I want you to think, did I ace this? Before I show you my annotations, I want you to see if you can find my A, my C, and my E. I think they're there, and I'll show you where I've highlighted them on the next slide, but I want to see if you can find them first. Pause the video if you need to read through it more carefully. All right, here's my annotated version of the prompt. First thing that you'll notice is that I did go ahead and restate or reword the prompt in my first sentence. And then I follow that up with my red highlighted section, which is my A. The major change that Confucianism brought to Chinese leadership over legalism, rewording the prompt, was that it, here's my answer, emphasized the morality of leaders rather than the rule of laws. Confucius encouraged rulers to lead by example. Now, it's a broad historical statement, but I followed that up with my direct specific reference to the stimulus and stated that rulers who are kind will inspire loyalty from their citizens. Now, this specific example might be stronger if I mentioned something about the 5 key relationships of Confucianism and how leaders had specific responsibilities in those relationships. I might also have mentioned the role of the sage emperors in Confucian belief and the idea that that all leaders were supposed to follow the good example of those who came before them. So I think I have a C here. I've highlighted it in blue, but it could definitely be stronger with some outside evidence in addition to what I've referenced from the stimulus itself. My reference to the stimulus, though, you'll notice, is a paraphrase rather than a direct quote. However, if we go back a couple of slides to the SAQ, we can see in the second paragraph, the master said, "Let him preside over them with gravity, then they will reverence him. Let him be final and kind to all, then they will be faithful to him." So my statement that rulers who are kind will inspire loyalty is a pretty clear paraphrase that I think any reader would be able to connect back to that stimulus. Then my E is where I go back and contrast this new Confucian model with the previous legalist ruler, and I mentioned the Qin emperors who imposed their will using harsh punishments for lawbreakers. Again, I could have elaborated with some additional historical evidence, but I think this response is probably just barely going to hit all of the marks for an ACE answer. If your answer was better than this, congratulations. If your answer doesn't quite hit the mark, try again and see if you can use some of your own details and examples from your reading notes to craft a better response that does hit all of the ACE points and far exceeds mine in quality. Once you've done that, have an awesome day, and I look forward to coming at you with another video soon.